We recording? We live? All right. Welcome back to Process and Reality. This is part 3, The Theory of Prehensions, Chapter 1, The Theory of Feelings. The organic philosophy is a cell theory of actuality, where the cell is one that is genetic and morphological. Genetically, the cell appropriates its foundation for existence. There are two ultimate elements for prehension, which is the appropriation of elements for process. These are actual occasions and eternal objects. All actual occasions prehend all other actual occasions, but only a selection of eternal objects are prehended. A formal consideration of an actual entity reference the objective intervention of other actual entities. The objective intervention of an actual entity is the transcending effects of the satisfaction from its perishing concrescence. These effects are the objective datum for actual entities to consume for the receptive phase. The objective consideration reference these effects. Therefore, it is pragmatic since it is concerned with these consequences. Section 2. The 5 factors of feelings: the feeling subject, the initial data felt, negative prehensions, the objective datum, or the totality of data, and subjective form, or the how of the datum is felt. The datum is the subjective form of the data. So, in my ignorant interpretation, I'm assuming there is a subjective form of the datum, and then another subjective form that comes from the datum. So, there's two of them, but I don't know. Moving on to section 3. A feeling is one particular aspect of its own subject. Quote, the feelings are what they are in order that their subject may be what it is. End of quote. Feelings are the subject, and the subject is their feelings. By virtue of feelings, the subject objectively conditions the world. The subject as both the subject and the object is called the superject. Feelings do aim at their subject, but this is not to say they are aimed at their subject. There is a false abstraction segregating the subject from its feelings. This would be a floating abstraction because a subject superject is its feelings. Such is the fallacy of the subject predicate dogma. Because every actual entity is causa sui, or self-causing, every actual entity transcends every other actual entity, including God. Section 4. Because every actual entity is causa sui, it is at once a subject of self-realizing and a superject of self-realized. The final nature of things belong in 3 categories, which are the category of subjective unity, objective identity, and objective diversity. Creation is a universe-wide social effort. Subjective unity is self-realization. The other 2 categories are about objective determination. Section 5. Subjective unity is subject qua unsynthesized feelings belonging to an incomplete phase of concrescence. It is the subject at work with feelings. God is the aboriginal instance of creativity, the primordial character. The second category states that any self-identity cannot be duplicated. You cannot confront yourself in alien roles. Any one thing remains ostensibly itself. The last category states that diversity cannot be devoid of contrast. Anything less is a contradiction. An actual entity can only add with what it has and can only fill when there is space. Section 6. An actual occasion can feel another actual occasion both from the source directly as a crude datum and mediated with a nexus. A physical prehension, just like a conceptual prehension, that is negative, is impressed with what it could have been. It has been avoided as a datum of feeling, yet may be important for future conditioning of creativity. Section 7. Intellectually, an actual entity is divisible into phases, but in fact it is undivided. In analysis, it is a process. It is felt in passing, but in nature, an actual entity is an atomic unity. Divisibility of an actual entity is only in reference to its transcendental nature. Moving on to section 8. Quote, a complex entity with this individual definiteness arising out of the determinateness of an eternal object will be termed a contrast. End of quote. The individual definiteness being the relatedness of two elements of the datum synthesizing individual particularities that infect the elements into joint particularities. However, I fear there is a circular reasoning when Whitehead says a relation is a genius of contrast. But there is room for alternative interpretation, I guess. Moving on to section 9. Particularity is both the particularity of conjoined unity of eternal objects and of actual entities. To recall the history of the Roman Empire is to both recall the contrast of eternal objects and the nexus of actual entities making up that history. Hume fails in making this distinction and confuses conceptual feelings with physical feelings. Moving on to section 10. Quote, a feeling is the appropriation of some elements in the universe to be components in the real internal constitution of its subject. End of quote. Elements are initial data. The perspective of the initial data is the objective datum, which involves negative prehensions. The subjective form is the essential novelty of an actual entity. Negative prehensions makes the initial data become the objective datum. In this process, the subjective form originates. A simple physical feeling feels the initial data as an actual entity. A conceptual feeling feels the objective datum as an eternal object. In a transmuted feeling, the objective datum is a nexus of actual entities. Both simple physical feelings and transmuted feelings make up the category of physical feelings. The subjective form is the ingression of an eternal object. Section 11. The subjective form has two factors, the patterns of quality and intensity. They are inseparable. The auditor of a note hears and feels it, like a musical note. The feeling is a feeling felt by a feeler, but also, quote, the auditor would not be the auditor that he is apart from this feeling of his. End of quote. The feeler is the feeler qua feeling, the feeling, and at once the feeling is feeling qua felt by the feeler. They co-author themselves into existence. Section 12. Prehensions are not atomic and may be divided and united into other prehensions. Prehensions are interdependent upon each other by their subjective form and the initial subjective aim. This is termed the mutual sensitivity of prehensions. Chapter 2. The primary feelings. Section 1. In a simple physical feeling, there is the subject and the initial datum. Both are actual entities. A simple physical feeling is the effect caused by the initial datum. Alfred North Whitehead says it seems to be humans can only be conscious of transmuted feelings, while feeling it and not simple physical feelings. Time is irreversible because cause is objectively in the constitution of effect. In other words, a feeling is felt by a feeler. A feeler is a feeling felt. The nexus proper to an antecedent actual world is not destroyed, but rather it is reproduced with novelties. Section 2. Conceptual and simple physical feelings are the primary feelings. All other feelings are made up of the primaries. No matter how vague, trivial, and submerged an actual entity always finds some way to positively prehend all actual entities. The same cannot be said about eternal objects. They may be utterly negatively prehended. The primary feelings are contrasted by virtue of the physical and mental poles of an actual entity. Thus, an actual entity is essentially dipolar. The immanence of an object is its realized determinants. Its transcendental nature is its capacity for determination. In both roles, it is relevant for something other than itself. Quote, the definiteness of the actual arises from the exclusiveness of eternal objects in their function as determinants. End of quote. Section 3. Valuation determines how an eternal object is utilized and its importance. Valuation is dependent on the other feelings in its phase of origination. Section 4. Consciousness is recollection of the unconscious. Quote, consciousness arises when a synthetic feeling integrates physical and conceptual feelings. End of quote. Chapter 3. The Transmissions of Feelings. Section 1. Quote, according to the ontological principle, there is nothing which floats into the world from nowhere. Everything in the actual world is referable to some actual entity. It is either transmitted from an actual entity in the past or belongs to the subjective aim of the actual entity to whose concrescence it belongs. End of quote. The initial subjective aim endows subjects with an inheritance of the ordering of things. That's how Whitehead referred to it as, the ordering of things. He's a bit vague there, but moving on, I quote Whitehead again. The transition of the creativity from an actual world to the correlate novel concrescence is conditioned by the relevance of God's all-embracing conceptual valuations to the particular possibilities of transmission from the actual world and by its relevance to the various possibilities of initial subjective forms available for the initial feelings. End of quote. The subject is the master of its own concrescence. When the subject has negligible agency, it merely, quote, receives the physical feeling, confirms their valuations according to the order of that epoch, and transmits by reason of its own objective immortality. End of quote. When a subject has significant agency, its modification of the initial subjective aim must be taken into account. Moving on to section 2. A feeling is physical when its datum involves objectifications of other actual entities. A simple physical feeling is subdivided into two subdivisions. A pure physical feeling, which has an actual entity which is the datum and is objectified by one of its own physical feelings, and a hybrid physical feeling, which has an actual entity forming the datum and is objectified by one of its own conceptual feelings. Both hybrid and transmuted physical feelings resolve the Cartesian mind-body false dichotomy. Quote, a hybrid physical feeling originates for its subject a conceptual feeling with the same datum as that of the conceptual feeling of the antecedent subject. End of quote. Due to these two conceptual feelings sharing different yet sympathetic subjective forms, they are unified as a hybrid feeling. There are two subspecies of hybrids, they being ones that conceptually feel actual entities without God, and ones that feel God conceptually, which is how God is objectified in a temporal subject. Moving on to section 3. Whitehead adds 5 new categories to the 3 from chapter 1, section 4. Quote, Category 4, the category of conceptual valuation. From each physical feeling, there is the derivation of a purely conceptual feeling whose datum is the eternal object exemplified in the definiteness of the actual entity or of the nexus physically felt. End of quote. Quote, Category 5, the category of conceptual reversion, the determination of identity and diversity depending on the subjective aim at attaining depth of intensity by reason of contrast. End of quote. This is the secondary origination of conceptual feelings besides eternal objects. Whitehead then abolishes the fifth category for failing to explain how unrealized eternal objects find proximation to an ingressed eternal object. Don't ask me why. I don't get it. Don't ask any questions, because I won't be able to answer them. Maybe Footnote to Plato is watching this channel, and maybe he can comment down below why he did that, why he needed to abolish that. Again, it's hard for me to follow everything, but moving on to section 4. Category 6, the category of transmutation. When a conceptual feeling is derived from a prehending subject, the subject may transmute the datum of this conceptual feeling into a contrast with at least some part of the nexus the subject belongs to. Quote, so that the nexus, ... is the objective datum of a feeling entertained by this prehending subject. End of quote. Section 5. Category 7. The category of subjective harmony. The valuations of conceptual feelings are mutually determined by their adaptation to be joined elements in a satisfaction aimed at by the subject. End of quote. Moving on to Chapter 4. Propositions and Feelings, Section 1. Quote, an eternal object refers only to the purely general any among undetermined actual entities. End of quote. Propositions differ from eternal objects by virtue of propositions are either true or false. Eternal objects lack this dichotomy. This is because propositions refer to definite actuality, while eternal objects are purely indefinite. A proposition is like an eternal object in itself, abstracted from actuality, since a proposition is a complex entity of eternal objects and actual entities integrated. The eternal object in a proposition is what Whitehead calls the predictive pattern. An eternal object refers to actuality in absolute generality. A proposition refers to only its logical subjects. A proposition's indetermination is restricted to its logical subjects. Eternal objects cannot demonstrate what they are until they are involved in some given fact. Section 2. Since not all propositional feelings are judgment feelings, we must not forget how much propositions mean to the actual world, including false propositions found in judgment. There is a diversity of non-judgmental propositional feelings, many that do not involve consciousness. Section 3. An indicative feeling is a physical feeling whose objective datum includes the requisite logical subjects. A physical recognition is a physical feeling involving a certain eternal object among the determinants of the definiteness of its datum. It provides predictive patterns. The indicative feelings and the physical recognition integrate into a propositional feeling. While the subjective form of a propositional feeling may involve consciousness or judgment, it must include aversions or adversions. Consciousness is involved in the subjective form of a propositional feeling when the affirmation-negation contrast enters, or in other words, the contrast between the nexus of the logical subjects and the proposition, which we will elaborate later. Consciousness feels the nexus and contrasts it with imaginative freedom about the placing of importance upon what the real thing is. Moving on to section 4. Founded on indicative feelings and physical recognition, there are two main types of propositional feelings: perceptive and imaginative feelings. Perceptive feelings are derivative and redundant, merely inheriting the antecedent propositional feeling. But if it is different from the antecedent propositional feeling, it is an imaginative feeling. The distinction between these two feelings lies on a diverse spectrum of degrees between each other. Moving on to section 5. Imaginative feelings arise out of a difference between indicative feelings and the physical recognition. Moving on to section 6. Language functions to arouse in the prehending subject some physical feeling indicative of the logical subjects of the proposition. And moving on to the last chapter of this part, chapter 5, the higher phases of experience, section 1. Any complex feeling is termed a comparative feeling. There are two simple types of comparative feelings: intellectual feelings and physical purposes. Intellectual feelings are the integrations of indicative and propositional feelings. Physical purposes arise out of the integration of conceptual feelings and basic physical feelings. Section 2. An intellectual feelings datum is a generic contrast. This contrast is between the actual entities of a nexus and the actual entities as logical subjects of a proposition. Each actual entity from either the logical subjects or the nexus is in contrast or a two-way functioning whereby these actual entities have one analyzable part. This actual entity is entertained as a sheer matter of fact contrasted with potentiality. The in fact contrasted with the might be is the contrast between affirmation and negation in propositional feelings. Whitehead terms this the affirmation negation contrast. The subjective form of the feeling of this contrast is consciousness. Consciousness achieves only a fraction of information salvaged from experience in dim apprehension. Quote, consciousness is the crown of experience, only occasionally attained, not its necessary base. End of quote. Section 3. A feeling includes belief when it has a proposition with a subjective form, including an eternal object termed a belief character. This eternal object has capacity of some gradation of intensity. Section 4. The recipe for consciousness is as followed. Start with some one basic physical feeling, integrate a propositional feeling called perceptive, integrate a comparative feeling arising from the integration of the perceptive feeling and the original physical feeling. And now you have achieved conscious perception. Section 5. Judgment is of three species: the yes form, the no form, and the suspense form. The first exemplifies both the pattern and the predicate. The no form claims incompatibility, and the last form has the predicate diverse from and compatible with the pattern, but not identical. Truth is absence of incompatibility of nexus and proposition in their generic contrast. Its sole contrast is of potentiality. Before we move on to section 6, we're going to be reviewing some quotes from both section 5, section 6, and including section 7 on pages 272, 274, and 276. So the quotes are going to be, quote, the condensed analysis of the stages of origination of an intuitive judgment is, first, the physical recollection and the indicative feelings. Second, the predictive patterns, the predictive feelings derived from the physical recollection. Third, the imaginative feeling derived by integration of the predictive feeling with the indicative feeling. And fourth, the intuitive judgment derived by integration of the imaginative feeling with the indicative feeling. This is our next quote on page 274. The process of origination of a suspended judgment consists in, first, the physical recollection and the indicative feeling. Second, the conceptual imagination derived from the physical recollection. Third, the propositional imagination derived by integration of the indicative feeling with the conceptual imagination. Fourth, the suspended judgment derived by integration of the indicative feeling with the propositional imagination. The relation between the objectifying predicate and the imagined predicate being such as to preclude either case of direct judgment. The suspended judgment thus consists of the integration of the imaginative feeling with the indicative feeling in the case where the imagined predicate fails to find identification with the objectifying predicate or with any part of it, but does find compatible contrast with it. And on page 276, the chain of stages in which a physical purpose originates is simpler than in the case of intellectual feelings. First, there is a physical feeling, then there's a primary conceptual correlate of the physical feeling, which is generated according to the categorical condition number 4. Third, this physical feeling is integrated with its conceptual correlate to form the physical purpose. Such physical purposes are called physical purposes of the first species. Section 6. Suspended judgment has nothing to do with probability. Rather, it is about compatibility. Section 7. Synthesis of a pure abstraction with fact is a generic contrast. All actual entities have a physical purpose. A physical purpose is more primitive than an intellectual feeling. Section 8. Quote, reversions are the conceptions which arise by reason of the lore of contrast as a condition for intensity of experience. End of quote. The second species of physical purposes originates by reversion in the mental pole of an actual entity. The objective immortality of actuality comprises the subject with anticipatory feelings of the transcendental future. Balance is, quote, the adjustment of identities and diversities for the introduction of contrast with the avoidance of inhibitions by incompatibilities. End of quote. The initial subjective aim aims for this balance. It procures intensities and stability. Rhythm in the world arises out of this intensity and stability. Quote, all aesthetic experience is feeling arising out of the realization of contrast under identity. End of quote. And the essence of conceptual feelings is not consciousness, but rather valuation. And now we're moving on to part 4. You'll have to tune in next time. Subscribe. You probably are already a subscriber if you're watching this video. Only probably 50 people are going to watch it.